Moment, we'll be joined by the writer Kevin Baker. His previous novel, Dreamland, was set in Coney Island just before World War I. He's now gone further into history, Paradise Alley, set during the draft riots of Civil War era New York City. And later we'll get another view of New York when we revisit with the architect and writer James Sanders. His latest work, Celluloid Skyline, New York and the Movies, featured in the city section of yesterday's New York Times. And featured on the cover of the Times book review, Kevin Baker. Paradise Alley received a wonderful review in the book review section. The book just been published by HarperCollins. It was described as an extraordinary new novel written by a richly imaginative fiction writer, a meticulous historian, a triumph. Dreamland was about Jewish immigrants largely to New York. Paradise Alley about Irish ones. What's the difference?
Well, that's an interesting question. They certainly interacted during all these periods. The Irish, I think, to use Moynihan's example, Daniel Moynihan's example, really kind of tried to set up life in New York as based on sort of an Irish village with a whole hierarchy that became the political machines, sort of based on how you would run a village with kind of the older people having more authority, everybody working their way up the ladder. I think the Jewish experience was much more one of trying to claim the rights that were promised in the Constitution and making America live up to its promise. They each added a great deal to the United States in their own way. They're both remarkable contributions from remarkable people.
One of the questions that the reviewer poses, one of the riddles that the book, both books try to come to grips with, is when an immigrant becomes an American. Something we're obviously grappling with today as much as we were in the 19th century or the early 20th century. When does that happen? How does that happen? How has that process evolved in 100 and more years?
Well, and that was one of the main appeals of this story to me, of the Irish immigrant story, particularly in the draft riots, which were mostly started and run by angry Irish immigrants who committed terrible atrocities, and also mostly suppressed by Irish immigrants who did amazing work.
Some of whom were terrific heroes.
Oh, did heroic work, and the police department is probably New York City Police Department's finest hour. And that's taking in quite a few hours. But there's Irish in the police and in the military units who put down the riot as well. So that was really this terrible crucible of becoming a citizen. It was to a certain degree, having to fight your friends and neighbors in the streets. Something even worse than what immigrants go through today. Although I think it's never easy becoming an American. I think there is always this whole passage that every group right now has had to pass.
The rite of passage somewhat different today than it was back then.
Yeah, but it's still, you still see people. I see people in my neighborhood working these, incredibly long hours. Probably some of them are illegal immigrants, living in, in bad conditions, and that always has been a constant part of the experience, unfortunately. But I think it says something very good for America, and there's such a love of this country, of being here, that people will put up with all these things.
The draft riots of 1863, it's an episode in New York City history and American history. Right. A lot of people forget, perhaps the bloodiest day of civilian uprising in the nation's history.
Right. I mean, it's hard to say officially what these things are, but that is the official highest death total. At least 119 died in the 3 full days of fighting, and a couple others. Some estimates put the total as high as 2,000. Oh, that's probably
what happened and
exaggeration. Well, the main thing that set it off was you had the first military draft in U.S. history, and a lot of these immigrants weren't terribly fond of the war in the first place. They went and fought and had signed up by the hundreds of thousands and had gotten slaughtered in being badly led by these various generals. So now you have a draft where they have to go, and on top of this, you can buy your way out of the draft for $300.
Right.
Yeah, $300. I mean, that was like a working man's salary for a year in those days. So they were enraged by this, and it was actually set off by a volunteer fire company, the riot, they wanted an exemption because they were firemen from the war. They didn't get one, and when a number of them were drafted, they went up there. It was a company called, ironically, the Black Joke, and went up there and turned over the draft barrel. You'd have the names being picked out of a draft barrel by a known blind man, and they turned over the draft barrel.
I think it's still up at the New York Historical Society.
Yeah,
if not the draft barrel, then one just like it.
And they set the office of the Provost Marshal on fire, and then they thought that would be the end of it. The draft would be stopped and they'd walk back. Instead, this whole conflagration started, ended up in this 5-day battle for all of Manhattan.
And federal troops, Union troops coming back from the front to help defend New York City.
Yeah, they actually had to bring federal troops back who had just fought the Battle of Gettysburg, had actually brought in to hold the city in the Union. Although the police had done an amazing job before that, wildly outnumbered by these mobs, and they just simply, for the most part without firearms, managed to put down these mobs, just charging into them with these sort of phalanxes, wielding their hickory clubs, locust clubs, and knocking people down.
One of the most horrific acts, of course, associated with the draft riots, the storming of the Negro, as it was called, orphanage on Fifth Avenue, I think right across from where the New York Public Library is today. There were lots of people, lots of New Yorkers, lots of immigrants involved in sacking that institution. Also a number of immigrants, including some young Irish New Yorkers, involved very much in saving the black orphans from that building.
Yeah, it was a terrible incident. The Colored Orphans Asylum on 43rd and 5th burned to the ground by these mobs. The orphans themselves barely escaped, and apparently were guided to, real story, guided to safety in part by a young boy, young white boy. So
Young white Irish boy.
Yeah, Irish boy. So you can't make these things up.
Welcome back to New York Close-Up, and to the writer Kevin Baker, author of Paradise Alley, just been published by HarperCollins, an extraordinary new novel, said the front page review in the New York Times Sunday Book Review. The last book, Dreamland, which was part one of this trilogy, City of Fire, was described as a historical fantasy rather than necessarily a historical novel. And in the forest of plausibility, the critic wrote, concentrating on the forest rather than every factual tree. Where do you draw the line? You're not writing this as a historian, you're writing it as a novel. Is it a historical novel, a historical fantasy, or is it some other art form that shouldn't be confused with either of the two?
Well, it is very closely based on reality, and actually Dreamland was too. I think the facts were just so unbelievable that people had trouble accepting them. Mm-hmm. It's a historical novel, which I think means you can take a certain liberty with the order of events, with individuals. But I think the novelist always owes a great obligation to truth. I would never, for instance, put in a character saying or doing something that would have been contrary to what we know about that character.
That would have been out of character,
historical record,
so to speak.
Right. But the amazing things you find just by accident. You know, for instance, the fact that during this whole battle, Winston Churchill's grandfather was basically behind the handles of a Gatling gun up on the New York Times building. He was one of the original owners of the Times. You know, you just can't make this stuff up. There he was holding off the mob.
It is pretty incredible when you go back and look at history and find out what actually happened. It becomes, in some level, tougher to write a novel. It's tougher to top. Yeah. One of the things the reviewer in the Times also said the book attempts to come to grips with, not in too heavy-handed or serious a way, is when the past is prologue, what we actually learn from history. History is fascinating to read. It adds rich perspective and context, but what do we learn in terms of the context of today's times?
Well, I mean, I hope from a story as terrible as the draft riots, we would always learn about the problems of not treating people fairly. When you do something like this terribly unfair draft, you're going to have an explosive reaction. I would hope we would learn something about racism. You know, the draft riots were terribly racist, and even though these people had been wronged, they took out all sorts of horrible things. Even though they were themselves a persecuted minority, they took out their anger on the relatively few black Americans who were in New York at the time, which was an awful thing and didn't help anything. And I would hope we'd learn a little about heroism. You know, one of the main stories of the book, main events of the book, again, a real incident in which this white Irish woman married to a black man went out into the street to save the life of her son from this mob. An incredibly heroic this story.
You take us on a tour. This is something you've done in stories for the New York Times, an op-ed piece recently on the old Tweed Courthouse becoming the new Board of Education headquarters. Tour of sites in New York that many New Yorkers might not even be familiar with. One of them, Seneca Village, which the Historical Society recently had an exhibit on.
Right, that was where I learned about it. This is a great story. There was this mostly black village, actually integrated, but mostly black village up in what is now Central Park in the 70s. Where people had just, with all the extreme racism of the time, having been pushed out of one place or another, had settled and set up this little town. Also Irish shanty town called Pigtown, which is also in the book, around what's now 59th Street in the park. All these people were living in then what was Central Park. And when the city decided to build Central Park, which was a great idea, nonetheless, they kicked all these people out. Many of them had no title to their land, so they ended up just being thrown out of their homes.
Paradise Alley Part 2 of the trilogy, Strivers Row, the third part. What's that about?
And that's mostly the black migrant experience in New York, set in New York City during World War II, 1943. It's another kind of crucial crossroads of the city's history.
Jumping back and forth in history, you did a lot of research, or did most of the research, for Harold Evans on the American Century, the book that you and he wrote that came out a couple of years ago, a big, thick volume on American history. Before that, you did lots of things. You went to Columbia, you worked 15 years, I read according to one biography, writing every day, never getting paid for it. You answered letters for Mayor Koch in the old Tweed Courthouse, in fact, behind City Hall. Why did you become a writer? How did you become a writer? And how did you get the perseverance to stick with it so long until you finally have been a big success?
Well, I became a writer sort of by accident. I got hired to write for local schoolboy sports when I was 13 for a local daily. The first job I had to learn to type to keep it, and I enjoyed that. And then I liked the idea of being a novelist more than actually knowing what it meant. But through doing it for years, I found that I actually liked this. So yeah, I wrote for 15 years pretty much every day, writing fiction. Of course, I had to find other ways to make a living, and that included some of these jobs like writing letters and being the chief historical researcher on the American Century. But it was a lot of fun having these other jobs for the most part. It was a lot of, you learned a lot of things. I got to do a lot of different things around the city.
I guess lots of people have different answers, but for you, Kevin, which is harder, fiction or nonfiction?
Oh, gosh, that is really hard to say. I think fiction is a little harder, but because you're a little less sure of yourself, but they're both pretty damned hard.
So at least nonfiction, you do have those boundaries that are already set for you. You may have to prove them and flesh them out, but there they are.
Right.
Fiction, it's wide open.
Right. You can take more liberties in fiction, which is a nice thing, but you're less sure of how good the writing is, how much you're making your points.
And I guess historical fiction, in a sense, imposes its own boundaries.
Yeah, very much so.
Okay, an extraordinary new novel, says the New York Times Sunday Book Review. Kevin Baker, Paradise Alley, just been published by HarperCollins.